Okay, so this video recording is for the lecture that for February 17th. This is the lecture that got canceled due to snow and ice. So today in class we were going to talk about modes of natural selection and sexual selection. So what I'm going to do in this video is go through as much of the lecture as I can that I feel comfortable doing kind of a lecture style format, and then we will do more of the activity-based stuff at the beginning of Thursday's class. But I really want to make sure that you have this background, what's in this video, before we jump into what we'll talk about on Thursday. So the learning objectives for what I'm going to cover today are I want you to be able to explain how sexual selection differs from typical examples of natural selection. So typical examples that the type of natural selection that we've talked about already in this class. And then I also want you to be able to explain how natural selection and sexual selection can result in evolution. And in addition, you should be able to describe the effect that natural selection has on average fitness in the population and genetic variation in a population. So the big ideas that we will hit on in this video are structure and function. So we've talked about this a little bit already in thinking about ecosystems. So this idea is just that all living systems are made of structural components, and the characteristics of these structures determine how the system functions. So we talked about this in terms of ecosystems. Today we're going to think about it in terms of the living systems being individuals. So the idea that individuals are made up of these structural parts that impact how the individual functions. And then we will also, over the next few class periods, actually the next 3 or 4 weeks, be talking about evolution. So this idea that populations of organisms have changed over time through both selective and non-selective evolutionary processes. So today we will continue talking about selective evolutionary processes, but then starting on Thursday and then continuing on the next Tuesday, we will talk about some of these non-selective evolutionary processes. So this is something that kind of a framework that I'm going to use to guide us through talking about all of these different evolutionary processes. So you read in your textbook, well, we've covered a lot, natural selection, and now you've read about sexual selection and genetic drift. So these are the first 2 evolutionary processes we'll talk about. There's also gene flow and mutation. Mutation we've also talked about a little bit already. So all 4 of these things, sexual selection being subsumed in natural selection, are evolutionary processes because they're all processes that can cause a change in allele frequencies in a population over time. So remember, that's our evolution. That's our definition of evolution. Evolution is a change in allele frequencies or genetic changes that occur in a population over time. So what we'll do is over the next few class periods, focus on how each of these processes causes evolution to happen. So what we'll be doing is going through these one by one and describing the process. We will talk about the effect that each has on average fitness in the population and the effect that each has on genetic variation in the population. So these are the 3 things that I want you to be able to do for each of these processes. Describe them, talk about average fitness, and genetic variation. So before we do this, in your textbook you notice that you saw a lot of these graphs where we have a bell-shaped curve, some phenotype on the x-axis, and then number of individuals on the y-axis. So what I want you to do is, in a minute, just pause this video and give yourself a chance to try to interpret the figure. So I want you to say in words what information this figure is providing to you, and then also think about how this graph would change if genetic diversity, in this case we're thinking about lizard body size as the phenotype that we're interested in here. So how would this graph change if genetic diversity and body size decreased in this population? Okay, so just pause the video and think about that, and then start it when you've thought. Okay, so hopefully when you interpreted this figure, you came up with something like this figure tells us that there's a range of body sizes present in this lizard population. There are some small lizards, some large lizards. Most individuals in the population have kind of an intermediate body size. So the fact that this curve has its peak here at an intermediate body size tells us that's the most common phenotype in the population. Okay, so that's what it's telling us. So in addition, if we want to know something about genetic diversity in body size in this population, what we want to do is look at the width of this curve. So this is showing us the range of phenotypes from very small lizards all the way up to large lizards. So assuming that body size in lizards is a genetic trait or heritable trait, the width of this curve tells us about the diversity present in the population. So if diversity in body size were to decrease, then we would expect somehow this curve is decreasing in its width in some way. So maybe it's shifting around a little or just becoming narrower all over. But somehow this curve is going to become narrower if we saw a decrease in genetic diversity in the population. Okay, so hopefully that's a good refresher for you. If you feel like you're still confused about what you're looking at when you're seeing this graph, then go back and look at the textbook some more and come to class on Thursday with questions prepared if you're still confused. Okay, so I want to give you a chance to do another quick exercise. In the Mastering Biology homework, you got a chance to answer questions based on the different types of natural selection that we see in populations, including directional, disruptive, and stabilizing selection. So what I want you to do here is I've given you really brief descriptions of different scenarios that we might see in a lizard population, and this middle graph here under scenario 2, this should say lizard body size as well. So I want you to think about this lizard that we just saw on the previous page. If we had a population of those lizards, read each of these scenarios and think about how we would expect the lizard population to change given this scenario. So over the next generation or a couple generations down the line. And so what I want you to do is to practice drawing how you think this curve would change in the population based on this fitness scenario that I've given you. And so do this for each of the scenarios. Your outcomes should look different for each one. So in addition to drawing how the distribution would change, I want you to pay attention to how you expect average body size to change. So in all these graphs, this dotted line is showing you the average body size before selection occurs. So think about, does that change based on the scenario I've described? Does it stay the same? And then also think about how variation would change based on each scenario. Okay, so again, pause this, think about each one, and then when you're ready to hear me talk about the answers to these, you can hit play again. Okay, so I just want to briefly go over sort of the answers to this activity. So here I'm just going to show them all at once. So for scenario 1, I told you that the lizards with the smallest and largest body size had the lowest fitness, which means the lizards with intermediate body sizes had the highest fitness. So that's what's being shown here. So if that happens, we expect these guys in the middle to be more successful in reproducing. So they're going to be having more offspring. So in the next generation, we would expect more individuals with intermediate body sizes, fewer individuals out here at the extremes. Okay, so this is what we call stabilizing selection. So it tends to maintain the same average phenotype. So average body size does not change, but the variation around that average gets smaller. So you can see here, we have a pretty wide curve when we're starting out, so there's lots of variation, and that variation has decreased as a result of stabilizing selection. The next scenario that I gave you was an example of directional selection. So in this scenario, individuals with large body size had the highest fitness. So again, we expect the individuals out here to be more successful at reproducing, so they're going to be producing more offspring than the individuals that have smaller body sizes. So as a result, we would expect more individuals here to be born in the next generation, and the average lizard body size would increase in the population. So you can see here's the average we started out with, and in the next generation, or however many generations later, that average has gotten bigger due to directional selection. The other thing that often happens, doesn't necessarily have to, but often does, is that directional selection tends to decrease genetic variation. So you can see we've lost some of these smallest lizards as a result of directional selection. So the width here that we see in this curve is lower after selection has occurred. So this is indicating that, like stabilizing selection, which decreased genetic variation, directional selection has a similar effect. So it reduces the amount of variation in body size in the population. Okay, the last one that I described was an example of disruptive selection. So here you can imagine a scenario where one source of selection pressure is causing individuals out here with large body sizes to have higher fitness, and probably a different source of selection pressure is causing the individuals with the smallest body sizes to also have high fitness. But for whatever reason, the individuals in the middle actually have the lowest fitness. So in an example like this, what we'd expect to have happen over time is for the individuals at either extreme, so individuals with these phenotypes would have more offspring, so the next few generations we expect to see more individuals with either small or large body sizes, and we would expect the number of individuals with intermediate body sizes to decrease in number. Okay, so here we have this kind of bimodal curve that emerges, and so again, what you see is that the average body size doesn't really change as a result of disruptive selection, or it doesn't have to change. But what we see when we look at genetic diversity is that the width of this curve has actually gotten bigger. Okay, and that doesn't necessarily have to happen. Okay, you could have disruptive selection where the extremes are selected for, and we don't get any more variation as a result of that, but we're at least maintaining the variation that was in the original population. So disruptive selection tends to either maintain variation or as a result of sexual reproduction, things that we'll talk about later in the course, you can actually get an increase in variation just because of the way that sexual reproduction works. So just to summarize this, if we go back to this chart that I have here, if we had to talk about the overall effect, or in general, the effect of natural selection on average fitness in the population, what we see is that natural selection always increases average fitness in the population. Because natural selection is favoring individuals with high fitness, in the next generation we expect to see individuals that are more adapted to their environment. Okay, so natural selection is the only one of the evolutionary processes that we'll talk about where this is true, and it's the only one of the processes that results in adaptation, where we see individuals more well suited for their environment. And as we just discussed in the previous slides, the effect of natural selection on genetic variation is variable. It depends on the particular circumstance. Okay, so we saw examples of types of selection where genetic variation can be increased, where it can decrease, or where it can be maintained. Okay, so it's variable, it depends on the particular scenario. All right, so let's talk about sexual selection. So again, sexual selection, I just want you to think of this as a particular type of natural selection. So it's nested within this overall category of natural selection. And the way that sexual selection differs from natural selection is that sexual selection is just selection based on success in courtship or obtaining mates. Okay, so we'll talk about both male-male competition examples of sexual selection and female choice driving sexual selection. So I'm going to start with male-male competition. So in examples like this, the basic idea is that males compete with one another, and the winner of competition gets to mate with a female. Okay, so there's lots of examples like this in nature that you're probably already familiar with. So lots of deer, elk, things like that have these antlers that they use to fight with other males. The winner of this fight will get to mate with a female. Beetles have similar morphology, so there are these stag beetles that have these horns that they use to spar with other males. The male that wins the fight gets the female. And then giraffes, actually, their long necks, even though they can help giraffes reach vegetation high up in trees, they are also used by males to fight with one another. So if you've ever seen, there are videos on YouTube that you can look up of male giraffes fighting for the opportunity to mate with females, and they're pretty vicious fights, actually. It's kind of astounding. But anyway, so the long neck of a male giraffe is actually something that helps it win fights with other males. So we've talked about structure and function, or we haven't actually talked a lot about structure and function when we talked about natural selection, but in all of the traits that we talked about when we thought about natural selection, the particular structure or trait that was favored by natural selection was serving some function that helped the individual either survive long enough to reproduce, or it was almost always about surviving to reproduce. So when we talk about sexual selection, structure and function is going to be a little bit different. So here, all of the structures that are favored by sexual selection are serving the function of either, so in male-male competition, the structures are always going to be traits that help males win fights. Okay, so when we're talking about female choice, these traits are going to be different. So females are making choices based on a number of cues, but in these examples, the males aren't fighting with other males. They're just trying to court and woo females and persuade the female to choose them to mate with. Okay, so all of the traits that are favored in these types of selection scenarios are going to be traits that make males more attractive to females. So it's not about winning fights, it's just about being attractive to females. And so here, if we think about structure and function in female choice sexual selection, the structures that are favored are going to be those that are good at attracting females. Okay, so that's the function that they are serving in the individual. It's not about surviving necessarily, it's all about attracting a female. Okay, so I'm showing you two different pictures of birds here. So female choice and sexual selection play a really big role in the bird world. And in particular, there's some really amazing examples in the Birds of Paradise, which both of these photos depict. And there's a pretty good video on the Birds of Paradise, and so I want to show it to you. So it's embedded in this video, and I'll also put the link to the video in the description on the YouTube video. You'll probably get a higher quality version if you just want to watch it separately. So while you're watching this video, what I want you to do is keep track of all the examples of traits that you see in these birds in the males that are helping them attract females. Okay, so just keep a list of all the things that you notice.
They go from expected to extraordinary in the blink of an eye.
You're awestricken. They transform themselves to something that you've never seen before.
They swagger and serenade. They dance and display. They're unlike any creatures on Earth, and one of the most astounding phenomena ever witnessed. The Birds of Paradise. Found here in the nearly impenetrable mountains and valleys of the island of New Guinea, in the greatest remaining tract of rainforest in the entire Asia-Pacific region. They exist nowhere else on Earth.
The vast majority of the land around here has no road access. You're just looking up into a wall of steep slope, and you can tell that this is just ridge after ridge and valley after valley.
Evolutionary biologist Ed Scholes and wildlife photographer Tim Lehman have spent the better part of a decade trekking into this isolated wilderness in pursuit of all 39 species of these miraculous birds.
I can see them displaying.
Well, the only way to see a kingbird of paradise is to climb up into the trees where they live, so I'm heading up to my platform.
They've been photographing, analyzing, and recording their every move, every behavior, in an attempt to comprehend their secrets. And in doing so, revealing extreme examples of the miracle of evolution.
Birds of paradise represent one of these singular events of evolution that stand out, that are extraordinary. They're something that's without precedent, something that evolved that's so unique and so exceptional that you're driven to say, why, or how did that happen? How did that come to be?
The birds of paradise are remarkable not only for their exceptional beauty and almost otherworldly appearance, but as veritable living textbooks on adaptation and sexual selection.
The females are looking at this whole package and can discern something about him by minor variation. The more complex it is, the harder it is to make it look right. If one little feature is out of whack, you're going to be able to tell.
What about New Guinea has led to these birds evolving here and nowhere else? What function do their outrageous plumes and ornaments play? And what exactly are they doing?
For me, it still always goes back to the original driving question, and that's, how did it happen? How did the birds of paradise come to be?
Witness diverse strategies of evolution at work, and experience one of nature's most extraordinary hidden wonders up close. A world where beauty and behavior are intertwined. A spectacle not possible any other place on Earth.
Okay, I'll stop it there. If we were in class, I would now call and people would give me examples of things that they noticed in the video, but obviously you're all watching this from home. So some things that you may have noticed were really brightly colored feathers that a lot of the males had. There were also lots of birds that were calling out, so singing songs, dancing for females. There were kind of these outrageous ornaments that some of them had. Okay, so all of these visual cues that you saw in the video are examples of traits that females often use to choose males. Okay, so things like color or pattern. And here I just wanted to give you a few more examples other than what you saw in the birds of paradise. So the cardinal is a bird that's probably much more familiar to a lot of you. We see them a lot here in Tennessee. So if you look at the males, they're the ones that are this bright red color, and the females tend to be this more drab color. If we look at guppies, the female guppy looks like this over here on the left. the male tends to be much more brightly colored with lots of spots. Okay, so males with more spots tend to get more matings with females. And then, of course, the kind of textbook example of sexual selection is the peacock. So the peahen, the female, is, kind of elaborate looking for a bird, but not that brightly colored. And then you look at the male, and he's this, brilliant blue with this huge tail with all the eye spots. And so males with more eye spots in their tails tend to be more successful in attracting females. And so one other thing to note about sexual selection is that it's primarily what's responsible for sexual dimorphism, or different morphologies in males and females. So for all species where the male looks different than the female, sexual selection has played some role in driving those differences. Okay, and the other thing that we saw in the video with the birds, and that we also see with frogs, is that females also can use songs or calls that males perform in order to choose their mate. And the Smithsonian article that I had you read for today's class was on the Tungara frog. And so this is a picture of the female over here on the left, and then the male who is in the process of doing his call to try to woo a female. And so what we will start class with on, let me see what's coming up next. Yeah, what we will start class with on Thursday is a review of this activity. So this is something that I intended us to do in class today, but what I'm going to do instead is post a handout on Blackboard, and I will send you an email telling you this is posted and the activity. And so what the activity does is it walks you through several different selection scenarios, all based on the article that you've already read, and also based on the questions that you already answered in the Mastering Biology homework. So even though this is all laid out in the activity or on the handout, I want to make sure it's really clear. So you're going to have 3 different selection scenarios on the handout. For each one, what I give you is the phenotype that we're going to be focusing on in this activity is male call complexity. So if you'll recall from the article, male calls can be fairly simple, or they can have all these chucks added to the end that make them more complex. So I am telling you that before selection occurs in each of the scenarios I lay out, this is the distribution of current call complexity in the population. And for all of the scenarios, you're going to assume that call complexity is a heritable trait. So kind of ignore the fact that males can exhibit a range of calls and just kind of assume that the ability to do a complex call is a genetic trait. Okay, that's what we're going to assume for this activity. So for each scenario, what you're going to do is predict how call complexity, how this distribution of call complexity would change in the population based on the selection that I describe in each scenario. Okay, and I hope that that gives you enough information to work on this activity. So what you can do is you don't necessarily have to print out the handout, but if it helps you, you can print it out and actually draw out on the handout your predictions for each scenario. And then what we'll do is at the beginning of class on Thursday, I'll give you a few minutes to sort of compare answers with people around you, and then we'll do a set of clicker questions based on the activity. Okay, so you won't actually turn in the handout, but you will use the information that you're generating on the activity to answer clicker questions in Thursday's class. And I'm hoping that we actually do have class on Thursday. If that gets canceled, then I'll obviously send an email and we'll figure something out to make up that class as well.